This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter, Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 29. A Weird Tale. On an early June evening, Rainbow Valley was an entirely delightful place, and the children felt it to be so, as they sat in the open glade where the bells rang elfishly on the tree lovers, and the White Lady shook her green tresses. The wind was laughing and whistling about them like a leal, glad-hearted comrade. The young ferns were spicy in the hollow. The wild cherry trees, scattered over the valley among the dark firs, were mistily white. The robins were whistling over in the maples behind Ingleside. Beyond, on the slopes of the glen, were blossoming orchards, sweet and mystic and wonderful, veiled in dusk. It was spring, and young things must be glad in spring. Everybody was glad in Rainbow Valley that evening, until Mary Vance froze their blood with the story of Henry Warren's ghost. Jem was not there. Jem spent his evenings now studying for his entrance examination in the Ingleside garret. Jerry was down near the pond, trouting. Walter had been reading Longfellow's sea poems to the others, and they were steeped in the beauty and mystery of the ships. Then they talked of what they would do when they were grown up, where they would travel, the far, fair shores they would see. Nan and Di meant to go to Europe. Walter longed for the Nile, moaning past its Egyptian sands, and a glimpse of the Sphinx. Faith opined rather dismally that she supposed she would have to be a missionary. Old Mrs. Taylor had told her she ought to be. And then she would at least see India or China, those mysterious lands of the Orient. Carl's heart was set on African jungles. Una said nothing. She thought she would just like to stay at home. It was prettier here than anywhere else. It would be dreadful when they were all grown up and had to scatter all over the world. The very idea made Una feel lonesome and homesick. But the others dreamed on delightedly until Mary Vance arrived and banished Posy and dreams at one fell swoop. "Laws, but I'm out of puff!" she exclaimed. "I've run down that hill like 60. I got an awful scare up there at the Old Bailey place." "What frightened you?" asked Di. "I don't know. I was poking about under them lilacs in the old garden, trying to see if there was any lilies of the valley out yet. It was dark as a pocket there, and all at once I seen something stirring and rustling round at the other side of the garden in those cherry bushes. It was white. I tell you I didn't stop for a second look. I flew over the dike quicker than quick. I was sure it was Henry Warren's ghost." "Who was Henry Warren?" asked Di. "And why should he have a ghost?" asked Nan. "Laws, did you never hear the story? And you brought up in the glen. Well, wait a minute till I get my breath all back, and I'll tell you." Walter shivered delightsomely. He loved ghost stories. Their mystery, their dramatic climaxes, their eeriness gave him a fearful, exquisite pleasure. Longfellow instantly grew tame and commonplace. He threw the book aside and stretched himself out, propped upon his elbows to listen wholeheartedly, fixing his great luminous eyes on Mary's face. Mary wished he wouldn't look at her so. She felt she could make a better job of the ghost story if Walter were not looking at her. She could put on several frills and invent a few artistic details to enhance the horror. As it was, she had to stick to the bare truth, or what had been told her for the truth. "Well," she began, "you know old Tom Bailey and his wife used to live in that house up there 30 years ago. He was an awful old rip, they say, and his wife wasn't much better. They'd no children of their own, but a sister of old Tom's died and left a little boy, this Henry Warren, and they took him. He was about 12 when he came to them, and kind of undersized and delicate. They say Tom and his wife used him awful from the start, whipped him and starved him. Folks said they wanted to kill him so they could get the little bit of money his mother had left for him. Henry didn't die right off, but he begun having fits, epileps they called 'em, and he grew up kind of simple, till he was about 18. His uncle used to thrash him in that garden up there, 'cause it was back of the house where no one could see him. But folks could hear, and they say it was awful sometimes, hearing poor Henry plead with his uncle not to kill him. But nobody dared interfere, 'cause old Tom was such a reprobate he'd have been sure to get square with 'em some way. He burned the barns of a man at Harborhead who offended him. At last Henry died, and his uncle and aunt give out he died in one of his fits, and that was all anybody ever knowed, but everybody said Tom had just up and killed him for keeps at last. And it wasn't long till it got round that Henry walked. That old garden was haunted. He was heard there at nights, moaning and crying. Old Tom and his wife got out, went out west and never came back. The place got such a bad name, nobody'd buy or rent it. That's why it's all gone to ruin. That was 30 years ago. But Henry Warren's ghost haunts it yet." "Do you believe that?" asked Nan scornfully. "I don't." "Well, good people have seen him, and heard him," retorted Mary. "They say he appears and grovels on the ground, and holds you by the legs and jibbers, and moans like he did when he was alive. I thought of that as soon as I seen that white thing in the bushes, and thought if it caught me like that and moaned, I'd drop down dead on the spot. So I cut and run. It mightn't have been his ghost, but I wasn't going to take any chances with a haunt." "It was likely old Mrs. Stimson's white calf," laughed Di. "It pastures in that garden. I've seen it." "Maybe so, but I'm not going home through the Bailey garden any more. Here's Jerry with a big string of trout, and it's my turn to cook them. Jem and Jerry both say I'm the best cook in the glen. And Cornelia told me I could bring up this batch of cookies. I all but dropped them when I saw Henry's ghost." Jerry hooted when he heard the ghost story, which Mary repeated as she fried the fish, touching it up a trifle or so, since Walter had gone to help Faith set the table. It made no impression on Jerry, but Faith and Una and Carl had been secretly much frightened, though they would never have given in to it. It was all right as long as the others were with them in the valley, but when the feast was over and the shadows fell, they quaked with remembrance. Jerry went up to Ingleside with the Blythes to see Jem about something, and Mary Vance went around that way home. So Faith and Una and Carl had to go back to the manse alone. They walked very close together, and gave the old Bailey garden a wide berth. They did not believe that it was haunted, of course, but they would not go near it for all that. End of chapter 29. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 30. The Ghost on the Dyke. Somehow Faith, Carl, and Una could not shake off the hold which the story of Henry Warren's ghost had taken upon their imaginations. They had never believed in ghosts. Ghost tales they had heard aplenty. Mary Vance had told some far more blood-curdling than this. But those tales were all of places and people and spooks, far away and unknown. After the first half-awful, half-pleasant thrill of awe and terror, they thought of them no more. But this story came home to them. The old Bailey garden was almost at their very door, almost in their beloved Rainbow Valley. They had passed and repassed it constantly. They had hunted for flowers in it. They had made short-cuts through it when they wished to go straight from the village to the valley. But never again. After the night when Mary Vance told them its gruesome tale, they would not have gone through or near it on pain of death. Death! What was death compared to the unearthly possibility of falling into the clutches of Henry Warren's grovelling ghost? One warm July evening the three of them were sitting under the tree lovers, feeling a little lonely. Nobody else had come near the valley that evening. Jem Blythe was away in Charlottetown, writing on his entrance examinations. Jerry and Walter Blythe were off for a sail on the harbour with old Captain Crawford. Nan and Di and Rilla and Shirley had gone down the harbour road to visit Kenneth and Persis Ford, who had come with their parents for a flying visit to the little old house of dreams. Nan had asked Faith to go with them, but Faith had declined. She would never have admitted it, but she felt a little secret jealousy of Persis Ford, concerning whose wonderful beauty and city glamour she had heard a great deal. No, she wasn't going to go down there and play second fiddle to anybody. She and Una took their storybooks to Rainbow Valley and read, while Carl investigated bugs along the banks of the brook, and all three were happy until they suddenly realized that it was twilight, and that the Old Bailey garden was uncomfortably nearby. Carl came and sat down close to the girls. They all wished they had gone home a little sooner, but nobody said anything. Great velvety purple clouds heaped up in the west and spread over the valley. There was no wind, and everything was suddenly, strangely, dreadfully still. The marsh was full of thousands of fireflies. Surely some fairy parliament was being convened that night. Altogether, Rainbow Valley was not a canny place just then. Faith looked fearfully up the valley to the Old Bailey garden. Then, if anybody's blood ever did freeze, Faith Meredith's certainly froze at that moment. The eyes of Carl and Una followed her entranced gaze, and chills began gallopading up and down their spines also. For there, under the big tamarack tree on the tumble-down, grass-grown dike of the Bailey garden, was something white, shapelessly white in the gathering gloom. The three Merediths sat and gazed as if turned to stone. It's the calf," whispered Una at last. "It's too big for the calf," whispered Faith. Her mouth and lips were so dry she could hardly articulate the words. Suddenly Carl gasped, "It's coming here!" The girls gave one last agonized glance. Yes, it was creeping down over the dike, as no calf ever did or could creep. Reason fled before sudden, overmastering panic. For the moment, every one of the trio was firmly convinced that what they saw was Henry Warren's ghost. Carl sprang to his feet and bolted blindly. With a simultaneous shriek, the girls followed him. Like mad creatures they tore up the hill, across the road, and into the manse. They had left Aunt Martha sewing in the kitchen. She was not there. They rushed to the study. It was dark and tenantless. As with one impulse, they swung around and made for Ingleside, but not across Rainbow Valley. Down the hill and through the Glen street they flew on the wings of their wild terror, Carl in the lead, Una bringing up the rear. Nobody tried to stop them, though everybody who saw them wondered what fresh devilment those manse youngsters were up to now. But at the gate of Ingleside they ran into Rosemary West, who had just been in for a moment to return some borrowed books. She saw their ghastly faces and staring eyes. She realized that their poor little souls were wrung with some awful and real fear, whatever its cause. She caught Carl with one arm and Faith with the other. Una stumbled against her and held on desperately. "Children, dear, what has happened?" she said. "What has frightened you?" "Henry Warren's ghost," answered Carl through his chattering teeth. "Henry Warren's ghost?" said amazed Rosemary, who had never heard the story. "Yes," sobbed Faith hysterically. "It's there, on the Bailey dike. We saw it, and it started to chase us." Rosemary herded the three distracted creatures to the Ingleside veranda. Gilbert and Anne were both away, having also gone to the House of Dreams, but Susan appeared in the doorway, gaunt and practical and unghostlike. "What is all this rumpus about?" she inquired. Again the children gasped out their awful tale, while Rosemary held them close to her and soothed them with wordless comfort. "Likely it was an owl," said Susan, unstirred. "An owl!" The Meredith children never had any opinion of Susan's intelligence after that. "It was bigger than 1,000,000 owls," said Carl, sobbing. Oh, how ashamed Carl was of that sobbing in after days! "And it grovelled, just as Mary said, and it was crawling down over the dike to get at us. Do owls crawl?" Rosemary looked at Susan. "They must have seen something to frighten them so." "I will go and see," said Susan coolly. "Now, children, calm yourselves. Whatever you have seen, it was not a ghost. As for poor Henry Warren, I feel sure he would be only too glad to rest quietly in his peaceful grave, once he got there. No fear of him venturing back, and that you may tie to. If you can make them see reason, Miss West, I will find out the truth of the matter." Susan departed for Rainbow Valley, valiantly grasping a pitchfork, which she found leaning against the back fence, where the doctor had been working in his little hayfield. A pitchfork might not be of much use against haunts, but it was a comforting sort of weapon. There was nothing to be seen in Rainbow Valley when Susan reached it. No white visitants appeared to be lurking in the shadowy, tangled Old Bailey garden. Susan marched boldly through it and beyond it, and rapped with her pitchfork on the door of the little cottage on the other side, where Mrs. Stimson lived with her 2 daughters. Back at Ingleside, Rosemary had succeeded in calming the children. They still sobbed a little from shock, but they were beginning to feel a lurking and salutary suspicion that they had made dreadful geese of themselves. This suspicion became a certainty when Susan finally returned. "I have found out what your ghost was," she said, with a grim smile, sitting down on a rocker and fanning herself. "Old Mrs. Stimson has had a pair of factory cotton sheets bleaching in the Bailey garden for a week. She spread them on the dike under the tamarack tree because the grass was clean and short there. This evening she went out to take them in. She had her knitting in her hands, so she flung the sheets over her shoulders by way of carrying them. And then she must have dropped one of her needles, and find it she could not, and has not yet. But she went down on her knees and crept about to hunt for it, and she was at that when she heard awful yells down in the valley, and saw the 3 children tearing up the hill past her. She thought they had been bit by something, and it gave her poor old heart such a turn that she could not move or speak, but just crouched there till they disappeared. Then she staggered back home, and they have been applying stimulants to her ever since, and her heart is in a terrible condition, and she says she will not get over this fright all summer." The Merediths sat, crimson with a shame that even Rosemary's understanding sympathy could not remove. They sneaked off home, met Jerry at the manse gate, and made remorseful confession. A session of the Good Conduct Club was arranged for next morning. "Wasn't Miss West sweet to us tonight?" whispered Faith in bed. "Yes," admitted Una. "It is such a pity it changes people so much to be made stepmothers." "I don't believe it does," said Faith loyally. End of chapter 30. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 31. Carl Does Penance. "I don't see why we should be punished at all," said Faith rather sulkily. "We didn't do anything wrong. We couldn't help being frightened, and it won't do Father any harm. It was just an accident." "You were cowards," said Jerry with judicial scorn, "and you gave way to your cowardice. That is why you should be punished. Everybody will laugh at you about this, and that is a disgrace to the family." "If you knew how awful the whole thing was," said Faith with a shiver, "you would think we had been punished enough already. I wouldn't go through it again for anything in the whole world." "I believe you'd have run yourself if you'd been there," muttered Carl. "From an old woman in a cotton sheet?" mocked Jerry. "Ho! It didn't look a bit like an old woman," cried Faith. "It was just a great big white thing crawling about in the grass, just as Mary Vance said Henry Warren did. It's all very fine for you to laugh, Jerry Meredith, but you'd have laughed on the other side of your mouth if you'd been there. And how are we to be punished? I don't think it's fair, but let's know what we have to do, Judge Meredith." "The way I look at it," said Jerry, frowning, "is that Carl was the most to blame. He bolted first, as I understand it. Besides, he was a boy, so he should have stood his ground to protect you girls, whatever the danger was. You know that, Carl, don't you?" "I s'pose so," growled Carl shamefacedly. "Very well. This is to be your punishment. Tonight you'll sit on Mr. Hezekiah Pollock's tombstone in the graveyard alone until 12 o'clock." Carl gave a little shudder. The graveyard was not so very far from the Old Bailey garden. It would be a trying ordeal. But Carl was anxious to wipe out his disgrace and prove that he was not a coward after all. "All right," he said sturdily. "But how'll I know when it is 12? "The study windows are open, and you'll hear the clock striking. And mind that you are not to budge out of that graveyard until the last stroke. As for you girls, you've got to go without jam at supper for a week." Faith and Una looked rather blank. They were inclined to think that even Carl's comparatively short though sharp agony was lighter punishment than this long drawn-out ordeal. A whole week of soggy bread, without the saving grace of jam? But no shirking was permitted in the club. The girls accepted their lot with such philosophy as they could summon up. That night they all went to bed at 9, except Carl, who was already keeping vigil on the tombstone. Una slipped in to bid him good night. Her tender heart was wrung with sympathy. "Oh, Carl, are you much scared?" she whispered. "Not a bit," said Carl airily. "I won't sleep a wink till after 12," said Una. "If you get lonesome, just look up at our window, and remember that I'm inside, awake and thinking about you. That will be a little company, won't it?" "I'll be all right. Don't you worry about me," said Carl. But in spite of his dauntless words, Carl was a pretty lonely boy when the lights went out in the manse. He had hoped his father would be in the study, as he so often was. He would not feel alone then. But that night Mr. Meredith had been summoned to the fishing village at the harbour mouth to see a dying man. He would not likely be back until after midnight. Carl must dree his weird alone. A Glen man went past carrying a lantern. The mysterious shadows caused by the lantern light went hurtling madly over the graveyard, like a dance of demons or witches. Then they passed, and darkness fell again. One by one the lights in the glen went out. It was a very dark night, with a cloudy sky, and a raw east wind that was cold in spite of the calendar. Far away on the horizon was the low, dim lustre of the Charlottetown lights. The wind wailed and sighed in the old fir trees. Mr. Alec Davis's tall monument gleamed whitely through the gloom. The willow beside it tossed long, writhing arms, spectrally. At times the gyrations of its boughs made it seem as if the monument were moving too. Carl curled himself up on the tombstone with his legs tucked under him. It wasn't precisely pleasant to hang them over the edge of the stone. Just suppose bony hands should reach up out of Mr. Pollock's grave under it and clutch him by the ankles. That had been one of Mary Vance's cheerful speculations one time, when they had all been sitting there. It returned to haunt Carl now. He didn't believe those things. He didn't even really believe in Henry Warren's ghost. As for Mr. Pollock, he had been dead 60 years, so it wasn't likely he cared who sat on his tombstone now. But there is something very strange and terrible in being awake when all the rest of the world is asleep. You are alone then, with nothing but your own feeble personality to pit against the mighty principalities and powers of darkness. Carl was only 10, and the dead were all around him, and he wished, oh, he wished that the clock would strike 12. Would it never strike 12? Surely Aunt Martha must have forgotten to wind it. And then it struck 11. Only 11. He must stay yet another hour in that grim place. If only there were a few friendly stars to be seen. The darkness was so thick it seemed to press against his face. There was a sound as of stealthy passing footsteps all over the graveyard. Carl shivered, partly with prickling terror, partly with real cold. Then it began to rain, a chill, penetrating drizzle. Carl's thin little cotton blouse and shirt were soon wet through. He felt chilled to the bone. He forgot mental terrors in his physical discomfort. But he must stay there till 12. He was punishing himself, and he was on his honour. Nothing had been said about rain, but it did not make any difference. When the study clock finally struck 12, a drenched little figure crept stiffly down off Mr. Pollock's tombstone, made its way into the manse and upstairs to bed. Carl's teeth were chattering. He thought he could never get warm again. He was warm enough when morning came. Jerry gave one startled look at his crimson face, and then rushed to call his father. Mr. Meredith came hurriedly, his own face ivory white from the pallor of his long night vigil by a deathbed. He had not got home until daylight. He bent over his little lad anxiously. "Carl, are you sick?" he said. "That tombstone over there," said Carl. "It's moving about. It's coming at me. Keep it away, please." Mr. Meredith rushed to the telephone. In 10 minutes Dr. Blythe was at the manse. Half an hour later a wire was sent to town for a trained nurse, and all the Glen knew that Carl Meredith was very ill with pneumonia, and that Dr. Blythe had been seen to shake his head. Gilbert shook his head more than once in the fortnight that followed. Carl developed double pneumonia. There was one night when Mr. Meredith paced his study floor, and Faith and Una huddled in their bedroom and cried, and Jerry, wild with remorse, refused to budge from the floor of the hall outside Carl's door. Dr. Blythe and the nurse never left the bedside. They fought death gallantly until the red dawn, and they won the victory. Carl rallied and passed the crisis in safety. The news was phoned about the waiting Glen, and people found out how much they really loved their minister and his children. "I haven't had one decent night's sleep since I heard the child was sick," Miss Cornelia told Anne, "and Mary Vance has cried until those queer eyes of hers look like burnt holes in a blanket. Is it true that Carl got pneumonia from staying out in the graveyard that wet night for a dare?" "No, he was staying there to punish himself for cowardice in that affair of the Warren ghost. It seems they have a club for bringing themselves up, and they punish themselves when they do wrong. Jerry told Mr. Meredith all about it." "The poor little souls," said Miss Cornelia. Carl got better rapidly, for the congregation took enough nourishing things to the manse to furnish forth a hospital. Norman Douglas drove up every evening with a dozen fresh eggs and a jar of Jersey cream. Sometimes he stayed an hour and bellowed arguments on predestination with Mr. Meredith in the study. Oftener he drove on up to the hill that overlooked the Glen. When Carl was able to go again to Rainbow Valley, they had a special feast in his honour, and the doctor came down and helped them with fireworks. Mary Vance was there too, but she did not tell any ghost stories. Miss Cornelia had given her a talking to on that subject, which Mary would not forget in a hurry. End of chapter 31.